Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Melissa Pineda, and today I will be discussing the book The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Before I get into the book, I'll just say a few things about Mr. Wells. So he was born in England in 1866 and died in 1946. He was considered a father of the science fiction genre of books. He was an outspoken socialist, and this kind of comes out in his book as well, which is in an interesting way. He apparently married his cousin and then divorced her and married one of his students. So he was a prolific author. This is a classic among other works of his. So I'm just going to dive right in. The Time Machine was published in 1895 and is a story about a scientist that builds a time machine and travels to the future. And the future that he finds is a very post-apocalyptic, dystopian, disturbing future. And so there is a original narrator to the story who's not the scientist. He is a guest at the scientist's house for a dinner party that the scientist kind of just arrives in. Everyone's already there. There's a couple journalists, a doctor, and he is at this dinner party. The scientist comes in from having time traveled and proceeds to tell the story about his experience in the future. And then the majority of the book is the scientist talking about what he experienced. The scientists realize shortly after arriving in this world that someone has taken or something has taken his time machine, because he kind of gets out, walks around a bit, comes back to where it was, and it's gone. So he decides to explore the world more after a few tears, of course. And he realizes that there are two types of quote-unquote humans, or what humans have evolved into or devolved in this sense. So the creatures he met were very strange, effeminate, and hairless. They were vegetarians. They seemed unintelligent and very, very simple. There were no stores, nothing that they seemed to create. And the children were actually miniature versions of these parents, of the parents that he encountered. And everything was dilapidated, everything was in ruins, ruins everywhere, and he actually made the comment that he thought communism had finally been achieved by the way everything looked. There were no cottages or houses, just palace-like buildings everywhere in what would have been the English countryside. So it's basically England, and specifically in one part, London, in complete ruins. So these people that he encounters, later called the Eloi, they were all alike. And the ease and security in which they were living was very apparent. There was nothing that they had to worry about at first glance. It seemed as though this was the case. There was a close resemblance of the sexes, and he's saying, in this book, the scientist is saying, it's what one would expect. The strength of a man and the softness of a woman, the institution of family, the differentiation of occupations are mere militant necessities of an age of physical force. So he's saying that where the population is balanced and abundant, childbearing becomes an evil and not a blessing to the state. Where violence is rare and offspring are secure, there is no necessity for an efficient family. So it was everyone just like living in a collective. The specialization of the sexes with reference to their children's needs had disappeared, this scientist observed. And we see some beginnings of this in our own time, he remarks, and in this future place it was complete. So he, like I said, thought that communism had succeeded, and this is what this utopian future looked like under communism. One of the remarks made by the scientist is that there were no apparent feelings. Like, no one cried, there were no feelings either way. One child was drowning at one point in the river, and no one really seemed to know how to swim, nor did anyone seem to care that this little girl or creature was drowning. So the scientist went in, saved her, and he didn't expect any thanks or appreciation from this little one because of what he had seen thus far in terms of, like no one really cared that she was drowning. But this little one was later called Weena, and she was very, very grateful and basically attached herself to him. And he clearly, throughout the book, had very strong feelings toward her, wanted to keep her safe and protect her. The scientists later discovered that the species were split in two. So humanity had actually devolved rather than evolved into two distinct races. So, like I'd mentioned, the Eloi were the people or the creatures that he had encountered, and then the other species were the Morlocks. And the former, the Eloi, were scared of the dark, while the latter were scared of the light, lived in the dark, and the scientists later found that they were eating the Eloi, were actually raising them like cattle, and were eating the Eloi, and the Eloi were vegetarians. So this division between the two species was basically like symbolized the duality of human nature, you know, the good and the evil. And well, basically, okay, spoiler alert, you're going to want to end this video now if you don't want to know what happens at the end of the book. But if you do, then continue listening. So the scientist wants to make a fire because the Morlocks are scared of the fire, and so, but he's exhausted at this point, has been walking for days. The Morlocks are kind of waiting. It gets a little scarier, waiting for him to kind of put his guard down, let his guard down, and fall asleep. And he's with Weena, and unfortunately, like, he starts a fire and then he does fall asleep, and he wakes up to fire everywhere, and the Morlocks, some of them like beating him. And so he fights them off. The ones that were beating him starts running, doesn't know where Weena is. Anyway, she ends up having been taken by the flames, so she died in the fire along with a lot of the Morlocks as well. And the Morlocks had initially taken his time machine, but he ended up finding it, and kind of like in this fight, the Morlocks almost think they're gonna trap him inside this creation that they had put the time machine in, except like that's exactly where he wanted to be, because he got himself back in the time machine, and then he ended up making it home. So he traveled to the future a few more times along the way. At one point, it was like 30 million years into the future, and he encounters really strange creatures, massive butterflies, crab-like creatures. So he does make it back to tell the tale of what happened to him. So the book ends where the original narrator goes back the following day to visit the scientist, and the scientist is preparing for another voyage. He's going to get back in his time machine and take off. And the scientist asks him to just wait half an hour, so he decides to wait, and then the book ends with like 3 years later, he's still waiting, and the scientist is somewhere in the future. And basically, the message from the epilogue, where the original narrator is speaking still, ends where the narrator wonders if the scientist will ever return. And he says that we should live as though the future is not black and blank, but that's exactly how this narrator feels. And even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and mutual tenderness still lives on in the heart of man. So H.G. Wells leaves us with this positive sentiment at the end of a disturbing book about a dystopian future that, you know, may or may not happen. Who knows? Time travel. But it was definitely a very, very enjoyable read, and a short read too. So if you just want something to take your mind off things, and you kind of fly through it because you get brought in pretty quick, and it's a very interesting story. So if anything I've said sounds interesting to you, I hope you pick yourself up a copy. I hope you enjoy it. If there are any questions or comments, please leave them below. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe. And until next time.